Welcome back to the Top Notch Documentaries YouTube channel. I'm going to be going over some more detailed events mentioned in the FBI files. These events really helped to shape Israel into the person that he eventually became. They occurred prior and whilst he was in the army. I hope you enjoy. The Keyes children were all homeschooled and ended up meeting other like-minded families in their immediate area within Washington state. Every month these families got together to enjoy potluck dinners and talk about their faith. The place where they would gather was a building named the Meeting Place, and a man named Kelly Harris had helped to build it. Kelly Harris eventually became Israel's boss. Many of the families who attended the Meeting Place resided there. It wasn't a church, but it was a perfect place to host these gatherings. Some of the families who attended the Meeting Place ended up renting space there so that they could live on the property. Sometime in 1995 or 1996, Jeff and Heidi Keyes, and these were Israel's parents, wanted to change. They wanted to live off the land and proceeded to sell their home, and since they had nowhere else to go at the time, they moved into the Meeting Place for a while. Around this time in the mid to late 1990s, his father John became ill. This would have put a huge amount of pressure on Israel at the time. John and his wife Heidi became ultra protective of their children, especially the eldest children. Israel was the second eldest child. Because of John Keyes' illness, and what this was exactly isn't mentioned, they relied on Israel to support the entire family, and they didn't want him to stay behind in Colville as they were all moving down to Oregon. Israel ended up staying in Colville for a few extra months so that he could make some extra money working. It was late 1996 and Israel was working as a member of a construction crew. He was taught carpentry skills by Kelly Harris and ended up in an off and on again relationship with his daughter. They had met just prior to his family moving to Oregon. Since both Israel and the girl came from religious backgrounds, they would write letters to each other in an attempt to hide the romance from their families. Meanwhile, Israel's family was down in the city of Dothan, Oregon. They lived with an unnamed family and were employed at their co-op health food warehouse. They were struggling financially, and so they relied on the generosity of this family. Israel would eventually join his family in Oregon. By now it was 1997 and Jeff and Heidi soon found out about Israel's secret relationship. Jeff and Heidi forbade the interactions for a year, and that must have been a rule set out by them. The girl's parents did the same for her. But through mutual friends, the pair continued managing to exchange letters. They were living in different states, which would have put a strain on the relationship. When Israel's family moved again, this time to Constable, New York, Israel continued to write letters. In 1998, they then headed up to Maine to join a new community, and Israel enrolled in the army. By this point, Israel was noticeably sick of his parents' lifestyle, and this act of joining the army was a clear sign of rebellion. Israel expressed relief that he'd left his family, and this was mentioned in his personal journal. This relief likely came from Israel being away from the stress and responsibility. During his time in the army, Keyes spoke to one of his army buddies about his parents. He referred to his parents as nomadic hippies who moved from cult to cult to cult. Israel resented this lifestyle, and this was partly why he left his family to join the army. His father was not happy with the decision. Israel did not dislike his parents, but completely opposed their belief system. He had plans to, or was already attempting, to save up enough money so that he could help his younger sisters leave the lifestyle that they had grown up in. And upon hearing this and everything else, the army buddy made the judgment that Israel or his sisters had been abused by their father. This assumption is further implied by an interview in the FBI documents. It mentions that Israel's brothers felt that John Keyes wasn't a nice man. Israel's brothers in Maine, and he had 3 living there at the time, had been disowned by Heidi Keyes, including her youngest son who isn't named. The army was a brand new environment for Israel. He openly engaged in debates with people who believed in God, and he made the comment that he believed that the Bible was ridiculous, standing firm in his belief that there was no higher power. Israel showed one of his army buddies a photograph of a young girl that he was obviously interested in. She was Amish. It doesn't specify if this was the same girl from Washington state, his boss's daughter, but it could very well be her. Israel made phone calls to her once or twice while stationed at Fort Lewis. The girl from Washington state ended up dumping Israel during his time in the army. She wasn't interested in waiting for him any longer. It was 1999, and the news of Kelly Harris dying from cancer in June of that same year led to them seeing each other again. Israel arrived at Harris's wake and he was still stationed at Fort Lewis. It was an awkward atmosphere as the two hadn't seen each other for a while, and to make the tension even worse, the wake was at Harris's own house. However, the awkward atmosphere didn't last long. There still must have been a spark between Israel and the girl, because Israel began sending letters months after the wake. He visited her multiple times in Colville in the summer of 1999, and they kept in contact. Israel sent a letter from Egypt just after the new year, and one of the lines in it read, "Darkness closing in, vice on heart." Israel was supposedly depressed at the time, and once confronted about the letter, he exclaimed that he did not remember writing it. That same year, Israel and the girl got engaged. By this point they shared their first kiss, and she believed in waiting until marriage for sex. Little did she know, Israel was already seeing sex workers abroad. The relationship was doomed to fail because they both had completely different worldviews. Israel was going through a rapid transformation during his time in the army. She was religious and admitted to being naive at the time. Israel was the exact opposite to her character by this stage. Israel must have masked his atheism pretty well because he continued to see her and her family without any suspicion about his actions on her part. On these trips he would rent different vehicles and travel from Fort Lewis to Colville. They travelled down from Colville and visited Israel at Fort Lewis in the spring of 2001, and Israel was due to be married in the summer. Israel told them that he was eager to leave Fort Lewis and did not want them to meet his army buddies. Just a short amount of time following this meet, Israel shared news which caused the relationship to crumble. He hadn't called for weeks prior, and something was clearly wrong with him. Upon making contact with him, he mentioned that he was depressed. He was confronted about his absent behaviour when it came to not calling. Israel shared the news that he'd slept with another woman. This was painful for the girl, but the most devastating news came when he admitted that he didn't believe in God. This was the ultimate end to the relationship. It was said that this girl was Israel's last hope. Who knows what is going to happen to him now? And the person's name who said this is redacted. I assume that it was someone from Israel's family. I feel like Israel was too far gone by this stage. If he had murdered his first victim years prior in 1998, he was already on the road to darkness. Months following the final breakup, Israel met Tammy and she became pregnant. They moved to Neah Bay, and then in 2002, Israel's father died. The cause of death was thyroid disease, and he passed away in hospital. In some of my other videos, I included the information that his father was anti-medication and didn't believe in modern medicine. This might have contributed to his death. Since much is not known about Israel's father, it is unclear just how Israel felt about his death and how it might have affected him. Did he feel guilty because he left? Or was he glad that he ditched his father and mother in search of something else? Whatever the answer, Israel didn't speak on his father in any of the interviews from what I'm aware. This could mean that he was at peace with the situation, but it could also mean that he still felt hurt by his father and still held guilt over the choice he made to respond by joining the army. Just from reading up on the records of some of these events, it is easy to see how Israel's life was stressful at the time, and how his poor choices derailed what could have been a promising future if he had used his challenging upbringing to motivate him to do something positive with his life. He was a skilled carpenter, and if he had channeled all of his energy into that, he may have turned out different. But Israel wanted to commit evil acts and still held resentment toward religion. He couldn't let go of his past, especially when it came to hating on religion. For all of the talk about how isolated Israel was from other children, it doesn't sound half as bad as it actually was. He made the decision to isolate himself through his own actions, and these actions, like vandalising homes and harming animals, kept other children away from him. Israel was caught and made to atone for the vandalising of homes. John helped him fix them and pay back the homeowners. Unfortunately, this probably further created a wedge between them. In conclusion, Israel's late teens sounded like a difficult time. Viewing life different from your family and being ostracised for it would lead to despair for most people. Many teens go through a rebellious phase but snap out of it, but Israel didn't change. He grew up with good people, these were his own words. He had knowledge of what was right and what was wrong, but he chose to do wrong. At some point, all of your past becomes irrelevant, as choices determine who you truly are. This has been the Israel Keyes video on some of the events that shaped Israel into the person that he became. As always, thank you for watching.